For 15 years, my life was an altar, and the god I worshipped was named Sterling. Not a deity of silver and gold, but of glass and steel. Arthur Sterling. The name itself sounded like a skyscraper, sharp and gleaming and impossibly tall. And I was the foundation he built his empire on. My official title was executive assistant at Sterling and Associates, but that was a lie.
A gross understatement.
I was his shadow, his second brain, his memory keeper. I knew how he took his coffee, black, 2 sugars, precisely at 7:15 a.m. I knew the names of his children's hamsters. I knew which clients needed flattery and which ones needed facts, which contracts had a hidden clause in paragraph 6, and which shade of architectural gray he would call inspired versus insipid. My world was a symphony of his needs, and I was the conductor, ensuring every note played in perfect harmony to support his genius. My days didn't start with the sun, they started with his schedule. 4:30 a.m. wake-ups to review the Asian market reports before his car even left his gated community. I'd packed my gym bag the night before, but I can't remember the last time I actually used it. There was always a pre-dawn fire to put out, a presentation that needed one more tweak, a transatlantic call that couldn't wait. My apartment was less of a home and more of a charging station for my phone and my body. I sacrificed birthdays, weddings, funerals. I remember my sister calling me, sobbing, when her first child was born. I was in the middle of a tense negotiation for the new waterfront project. I whispered, "I'm sorry, I have to go," and clicked off the line. I sent a lavish gift basket from a high-end baby boutique 2 days later, the purchase order signed off by Sterling himself as a client relations expense. He thought it was for the mayor's new grandchild. I never corrected him. The guilt was a stone in my stomach, but the pride I felt when we won that contract, when he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "We did it, Elena. We did it," that pride was a drug. It made the sacrifices feel noble. I didn't just work for him. I believed in him. I saw the spark in his eyes when he'd unroll a fresh blueprint, the way his hands would trace the lines as if he were caressing the face of a lover. He was brilliant, a visionary. And I was the gatekeeper of that vision. I protected his time. I polished his words. I anticipated his every move. My identity was so entwined with his success that I couldn't see where Elena ended and Sterling's indispensable assistant began. My friends, the few I had managed to keep, would joke that I was in a cult. I'd laugh it off, but deep down, a part of me knew they were right. I was a true believer. My devotion was absolute. I had given him the best years of my life, the sharpest hours of my mind, the deepest reserves of my loyalty. I had built my entire world inside the glass walls of his firm, and I truly believed it was a fortress. The day it all shattered was a Tuesday. It was overcast, the sky the color of concrete, which felt appropriate. We were in the main conference room, the one with the panoramic view of the city we had helped build. The air was thick with tension. We were up for the landmark Phoenix Tower project, the biggest contract in the firm's history. It was my baby as much as it was his. I had spent 6 months on the proposal, sleeping an average of 4 hours a night. I'd unearthed zoning codes from the 1920s. I'd charmed the notoriously difficult head of the City Planning Commission. I'd personally overseen the 3D model rendering until the lines were so clean they could cut you. We were in the final round, and a rumor had started to circulate that our main competitor, a younger, flashier firm, had a more innovative energy solution. The investors were getting nervous. The room was full of anxious faces, junior architects and senior partners, all looking to Sterling for reassurance. He was pacing his jaw tight. He looked at the projected numbers on the screen, then at me. "The energy expenditure reports," he snapped, his voice echoing in the silent room. "They're questioning our efficiency metrics, Elena. Why wasn't this handled?" My blood ran cold. "Sir, they're the standard metrics. I cross-checked them with the top 3 engineering firms in the country. They're solid." I kept my voice even, professional, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. He scoffed, a nasty, dismissive sound. "Solid isn't good enough. Standard is what loses bids. I needed you to be ahead of this. I needed you to anticipate." He was speaking to me, but his eyes were scanning the room, performing for the others. He was looking for a scapegoat. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, some with pity, some with a cold curiosity. These were people I had mentored, people whose personal crises I had helped manage, people who called me the office mom. Now they just stared. Arthur, I said, my voice softer now, trying to de-escalate. The innovation is in the structural design, the materials. That was our strategy. He walked right up to the table, leaning his knuckles on the polished wood, his face inches from mine. The smell of his expensive cologne, a scent I had associated with success for so long, suddenly made me nauseous. Your strategy? He laughed, but there was no humor in it.
It was a cruel, ugly sound.
You don't have a strategy.
You execute my strategy.
And lately, you haven't even been doing that right. He straightened up and addressed the room. The problem is complacency. People get comfortable. They think they're part of the furniture. They forget that everyone. And here he turned his head and pinned me with a look of pure, chilling indifference. Is replaceable. The word hung in the air, a poison dart. Replaceable. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. 15 years of my life, my unwavering loyalty, my endless sacrifices, all reduced to that single, brutal word. It wasn't just an insult. It was an erasure. He was erasing my contribution, my value, my very existence within those walls. The silence in the room was deafening. No one spoke. No one defended me. They just looked away, studying their notepads, the ceiling, the view of the city I had given everything to shape. And in their silence, I understood. I was alone. The fortress I had built was a house of cards, and the king had just blown it all down. In that moment, my world fell away. It was the deepest pain I had ever felt. If you've ever gone through a great disappointment and understand what it's like to have your heart broken, please like this video so I know I'm not alone in this journey. The days that followed are a blur of gray. I didn't just leave Sterling and Associates. I felt like I had been exiled from my own life. I walked out of that conference room, packed the few personal items from my desk, a framed photo of my parents, a chipped mug, a thriving succulent I'd somehow kept alive, and never looked back. The first week, I slept. I slept like I hadn't in over a decade, a heavy, dreamless sleep that was more like a coma. But when I was awake, the darkness was absolute. The silence in my apartment was no longer a brief respite. It was a screaming void. My phone, which used to buzz incessantly with calls and emails and reminders, was dead silent. My identity, so tightly woven into my job, had been stripped away, and I had no idea who I was without it. I was Sterling's right hand, the woman who made things happen. Now I was just Elena, and I didn't know who that was anymore. My confidence was shattered. That word, replaceable, echoed in my head, a constant, tormenting whisper. I started looking for jobs, but my resume was a paradox. I was overqualified for any executive assistant position and underqualified on paper for the project management roles I knew I could do in my sleep. My skills were invisible, woven into another man's success. I'd get to the final interview stage and they'd ask, "So, your role was primarily supportive?" And I'd hear his voice, "You execute my strategy." The money I had saved, which I once thought was a healthy cushion, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The city was expensive, and my pride wouldn't let me reach out to my family and admit how completely I had failed. Loneliness became a physical presence, a cold weight on my chest. I'd walk through the city and see the buildings we had built, their glass and steel facades reflecting a life that was no longer mine. It was a special kind of torture, being haunted by your own legacy. I hit rock bottom about 6 months in. I was living on credit cards, avoiding calls from unknown numbers, and my diet consisted mostly of instant noodles and self-pity. My apartment was a mess. My energy was gone. I felt like a ghost in my own life. It was during that time that I got the call that my grandmother's house, which had sat empty since she passed away 5 years prior, had finally been sold. I needed to clear out the last of her belongings from the attic. The thought of the task felt monumental, but the threat of the new owners disposing of her things was the one thing that could get me out of bed. I drove the 2 hours to her small, quiet town, the town I had been so eager to escape for the bright lights of the city. The house smelled of dust and lavender and memories. The attic was hot and stuffy, filled with the ghosts of a life well lived. I sorted through old clothes, chipped china, and faded photographs. I was about to give up, overwhelmed by the heat and the grief, when I saw it tucked away in a dark corner, a large, flat wooden trunk bound with leather straps. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. With some effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside, it wasn't filled with old linens or keepsakes. It was filled with dozens of rolled-up parchments, hardbound journals, and boxes of drafting pencils. I unrolled one of the parchments. It was an architectural drawing, but unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a design for a library, but instead of fighting the landscape, it was part of it. A massive oak tree grew right through the center of the reading room, its branches spreading out to form a living canopy. The walls were made of rammed earth and recycled glass, and the entire structure was designed to use natural light and airflow. It was beautiful, organic, and alive. I opened one of the journals. The pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant cursive and intricate sketches. I had always known she was a gifted artist, but I had no idea about this. She wrote about something she called empathetic architecture, the idea that buildings should be designed not just for function, but for the well-being of the people and the planet. That a space should feel like a sanctuary, not a sterile box. She had designed homes with indoor gardens, community centers with rainwater harvesting systems, schools where every classroom opened up to the outdoors. It was a philosophy born of a deep respect for nature and a profound understanding of the human spirit. She had been a self-taught genius, a visionary in her own right, but as a woman in the 1950s, she never had the chance to see her designs built. Her dreams were packed away in this trunk. As I sat there on the dusty floor of the attic, surrounded by my grandmother's forgotten world, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't a huge wave of inspiration, not a sudden epiphany. It was much smaller, much more fragile than that. It was a tiny, flickering facega, a spark of curiosity, of connection. It was the realization that this passion, this different way of seeing the world, was a part of my own DNA. It was a legacy I never knew I had. And in the suffocating darkness of my failure, that tiny spark was just enough to light the way. That spark from the attic didn't become a bonfire overnight. For weeks, it was just a faint warmth I carried inside me. I brought the trunk back to my city apartment, and it felt like I had brought home an anchor. The journals and drawings became my obsession. I spent my days and nights poring over them, deciphering my grandmother's notes, studying her sketches. Her philosophy was the complete opposite of everything Sterling had taught me. He built monuments to ego. She designed spaces for the soul. He dominated the landscape. She collaborated with it. It felt like I was unlearning 15 years of doctrine and discovering a language I was born to speak. I started sketching again, tentatively at first. My skills were rusty, buried under years of creating PowerPoint presentations and financial reports. But my grandmother's work guided me. I enrolled in online courses for modern architectural software, using the last of my credit to pay for them. I'd watch tutorials until 3 a.m, my eyes burning, and then I'd spend the whole next day trying to render one of her concepts, blending her hand-drawn elegance with modern technology. It was grueling. There were so many moments of doubt. I was broke, I was alone, and I was trying to build a new career from scratch based on the forgotten dreams of a woman most of the world had never known. The rejection letters for freelance drafting work kept coming. Not enough recent experience, they all said. More than once, I collapsed onto my couch, surrounded by sketches, and just cried, convinced I was a fool chasing a ghost. But then a small breakthrough. My sister, the one whose son's birth I had missed, saw what I was doing. She didn't lecture me or say, "I told you so." She just saw the passion in my eyes that had been missing for so long. Her son's local elementary school had a small and used courtyard, a sad patch of cracked concrete and weeds. They had a tiny budget, scraped together from bake sales, to turn it into an outdoor learning space. She asked if I would be willing to draw up a design. It was unpaid, a charity project. It was perfect. I threw myself into it. I used every principle from my grandmother's journals. I designed a covered pavilion using reclaimed wood, a rainwater harvesting system to feed a small vegetable garden the kids could tend to, and benches built into a living wall of native plants. I didn't just email the design. I built a detailed physical model, just like she would have. When I presented it to the PDA, I didn't talk about costs and materials. I talked about how the space would feel, how the smell of the plants would calm anxious children, how the dappled sunlight through the pavilion would inspire creativity. I spoke my grandmother's language, and they saw it. They loved it. A local lumberyard agreed to donate most of the materials, and parents volunteered on weekends to help build it. I was there every single day, with a hammer in my hand, sawdust in my hair. I wasn't an executive assistant. I was a builder. The day it was finished, the kids swarmed into the space. They ran their hands over the rough wood. They looked up at the green wall with wide eyes, and they sat on the benches, reading books in the sunshine. The principal, a woman with kind eyes, came and stood beside me. She said, "You haven't just built a garden, Elena. You've given our children a piece of peace." In that moment, watching a little girl gently touch the petal of a flower she had helped plant, I felt a sense of purpose so profound it brought tears to my eyes. That was my first true victory. It wasn't about a multi-million-dollar contract. It was about creating a small pocket of joy. A parent who had volunteered on the project happened to run a popular local design blog. He wrote a post about the empathetic courtyard and the unknown architect who designed it. He posted pictures of the kids enjoying the space. From there, something shifted. My phone, which had been silent for so long, started to ring. First, it was a young couple who had bought a small plot of land and wanted to build a sustainable, affordable home. They had a tight budget but a big dream. I used my grandmother's principles to design them a house that was small in square footage but felt huge because of its connection to the outdoors. They cried when they saw the final plans. After that, a nonprofit organization hired me to redesign their women's shelter, to make it feel less like an institution and more like a sanctuary for healing. Each project was small, but it was meaningful. I wasn't just designing buildings. I was helping people. My reputation started to grow, slowly at first, then all at once. People started calling me the soulful architect. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something real, something that was entirely mine. I could finally pay my rent without holding my breath. I moved into a slightly larger apartment that had enough space for a proper drafting table. I was working harder than I ever had for Sterling, but for the first time, the work was feeding my soul instead of draining it. I was becoming known for a style that was the antithesis of his cold, corporate monoliths. I was creating spaces that breathed. It was there, with my own hands, that I started to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my comeback journey is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and be a part of this community of new beginnings. The pinnacle of this new life, the moment I knew things had truly changed, arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was an invitation from the National Architectural Association. They were hosting their annual industry gala, the most prestigious event of the year, a black-tie affair I had attended a dozen times, always standing a few feet behind Arthur Sterling, holding his coat and his speech cards. This time, the invitation was different. They weren't inviting me to attend. They were inviting me to be the keynote speaker.
Me.
Elena, the soulful architect. The woman who had started over with nothing but her grandmother's forgotten journals. The news sent a shockwave of terror and exhilaration through me. The irony was almost too much to bear. The theme of the gala this year was the future of architecture, sustainability, and humanity. It was as if they had written it just for me. For weeks, I prepared. I didn't write a speech about building materials or zoning laws. I wrote a story. My grandmother's story. The night of the gala, I stood backstage, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was wearing a simple, elegant green dress, the color of new leaves. I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses. Then, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Elena." I turned. It was him, Arthur Sterling. He looked older. The sharp confidence in his eyes had been replaced by a certain weariness. His firm had lost the Phoenix Tower project, and their signature style of imposing, sterile skyscrapers was falling out of fashion, criticized for being soulless and environmentally irresponsible. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne.
He offered one to me.
I politely declined. "I saw your name on the program," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Keynote speaker." I have to say, I was surprised. I just looked at him, my expression calm. The terrified assistant, who would have stammered an apology, was long gone.
Why?
I asked simply. He seemed taken aback by my directness. "Well, you were always so behind the scenes. So good at supporting the vision. I never realized you had your own." I let the silence hang for a moment before I replied. "I was good at supporting your vision, Arthur. That's what you paid me for." He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes darting around the backstage area. He was clearly uncomfortable. Listen, Elena, about that day in the conference room. It was a high-pressure situation. I was on edge. I said things. You said I was replaceable. I finished for him, my voice not accusatory, just stating a fact. He had the decency to flinch.
Yes. Well.
Clearly, I was wrong, he said, gesturing vaguely at the stage. What you've done, this whole empathetic architecture thing, it's catching on. It's smart. You found a niche. He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone he used in negotiations. My firm, we're looking to diversify. We need to get into the sustainability space. A new wing, a new vision. Someone like you at the helm, it would be a powerful statement. We could call it the Elena Collection by Sterling and Associates. I stared at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or pain. I felt a profound sense of pity.
He still didn't get it.
He saw my work, my soul, my grandmother's legacy, as a niche to be exploited, a brand to be acquired. He thought he could buy me back and put his name on my life's purpose. I gave a small, quiet laugh. Thank you for the offer, Arthur, I said, my voice steady and clear. But my work isn't a collection. It's a philosophy, and it could never exist inside your walls. The best thing you ever did for me was letting me go. You showed me that the foundation I was standing on was unstable. So I went and built my own. I saw a flash of the old anger in his eyes, the frustration of not getting what he wanted. But it was quickly replaced by a look of resignation. He knew he had lost. He had no power over me anymore. Good luck with your speech, Elena, he said stiffly and walked away. A few minutes later, I was introduced. I walked onto the stage, into the warm, bright lights. I looked out at the sea of faces, hundreds of the most influential people in my industry. And in the third row, I saw him, sitting alone at his table, looking small in the vast ballroom. I took a deep breath, walked to the podium, and looked out at the crowd. I didn't feel fear. I felt peace. A deep, unshakable peace that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I stood for. My legacy wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving my grandmother right. It was about the quiet courtyards, the sunlit homes, the healing sanctuaries. It was about creating spaces where people felt seen, connected, and at peace. It was about building a world where no one felt replaceable. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past don't define who we are, but what we do with them does. Thank you so much for listening to my story this far. If it touched you, share it with someone who needs a light, and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.